Hi, my name's Craig Iliffe. I'm the Associate Dean Postgrad here at the Law School, and I am here to introduce and to coordinate our session this afternoon, which is on the future of law after COVID-19. Just a few matters before I introduce our wonderful panelists. They're just sort of housekeeping type matters and important for you guys. The first is that this is a recorded session, so we will have copies of the recording available afterwards. But and I would encourage very strongly for you to ask questions. Please use the question and answer function, which is in this Zoom program, to ask your questions, and I'll be picking those up. There is also a chat function in there as well too. Probably best if you use question and answer, because it'll just make it easier for me, but of course I'll look at chat as well too. Your name will be publicly visible, so please just be aware of that. Not that that's problematic in any way. Well, let me introduce the topic and then our speakers. Who would have thought that we would have had the 2020 year that we have had? And it's been extraordinary for us here as academics, but I absolutely know it's been equally as unusual for people involved in their legal jobs and practice and in commerce. So the point of this seminar is sort of really to consider, are we seeing some major long-term trends and changes in the way in which law will work and operate? What are the immediate and the medium-term and longer-term consequences? And I suppose, you know, one of the issues here is that there will be students looking and thinking about jobs and considering issues for the future. They'll be wondering about, you know, areas of law, areas of commercial practice. There will be definitely some sort of seismic changes, both to the economy and to the workplace. So that's the point of us discussing these matters. We've got some wonderful people to lead our discussion, and I'll introduce them now. So Professor Prasanna Gai. Now, Prasanna is actually a most prestigious and extraordinary professor from the business school here at the University of Auckland. His background, his work applies ideas from network and game theory to understand the causes and consequences of financial crises. So we couldn't have a better person. He's the author of Systemic Risk, The Dynamics of Modern Financial Systems, and Private Sector Involvement and International Financial Crises. Those are both Oxford University Press books. He's currently serving a 4-year term on the Advisory Scientific Committee of the European Systemic Risk Board. He was elected a visiting fellow of All Souls College at the University of Oxford, and was a special advisor to the Governor Mark Carney of the bank at the Bank of Canada early on, and Mark was actually the governor of the UK Reserve Bank as well too, I think, or whatever the equivalent is in the UK. So thank you very much, Prasanna. And Prasanna is going to lead off our discussion and set the scene. And then he'll be followed by Sasha Daniels. Now, Sasha is a senior counsel at Spark, the technology company. He's the lead legal business partner and head of legal for technology, property, competition law and regulation at Spark. I'm delighted to say that he holds an LLM with first class honours from the University of Auckland. In 2017, he won the award for the Competition Individual of the Year at the Asia Pacific Council Awards, and was named as the In-House Lawyer of the Year at the New Zealand Law Awards. He was the winner of the Gaze Burt Prize for having the highest GPA in his LLM. More recently, Sasha's team and the rest of the Spark legal team won the awards for the New Zealand In-House Team of the Year at the 2019 New Zealand Law Awards and the 2020 Australasian Law Awards in recognition for the depth, breadth and innovative nature of the work that they do. And certainly last but not least, we just delighted and thank Jennifer Caldwell for coming. She's the Auckland National Chair of Buddle Finlay, and Jennifer specialises in resource management, environmental and local government law. She has extensive experience as a strategic advisor and specialist litigator in the Environmental Court and the High Court and higher courts. She's a leading New Zealand lawyer advising on consent and destination projects and strategic planning processes. She's also a National Executive Committee member of the Resource Management Law Association. I imagine that because of the infrastructural changes we've seen some, Jennifer, you've seen some enormous opportunities and changes in your practice. So without any further ado, let me pass over to Prasanna, and Prasanna's going to give just a little bit of a focus, an economic focus on the challenges and the economic issues that we are being faced with.
Okay, thank you, Craig, and thank you very much for having me here. It's a wonderful opportunity, and I'm very much looking forward to the conversation that we have. I'm going to touch on two themes, and they're going to be at, I guess, the level of 36,000 feet, and so fairly high level, but obviously in the conversation we can perhaps narrow things down. And I'm going to focus on two themes in particular. The first being the lockdown and the economy, broadly defined, and then another theme which is really about institutions and competence in government and governance. And I think both of these are going to be crucial for the way ahead. So with that as a sort of broad roadmap, let me plunge in. This crisis is a very unusual one. For a start, there is the anachronism of the whole affair. We've seen a revival of a medieval walled city, the so-called lockdowns, in an age where prosperity depends on free trade and labor mobility. And that's a very unusual thing. So economists like thinking about technology. So we are really adopting a very medieval technology to deal with this pandemic. And that's something that has never been really thought about before, and has never really figured in the imaginations of any economist. So we're grappling, I think, as a subject to get to grips with that, when quite clearly technology and more targeted approaches might be preferable in some sense. But be that as it may, this crisis is unparalleled in terms of its ferocity. I mean, it's the biggest shock, if you like, since the Great Depression. And we're talking something of that magnitude. The other very unusual thing about this crisis is that it's not the consequence of failings on the parts of individuals or firms or businesses. What you see is it's a consequence of governments choosing this lockdown strategy. And all the policy responses that you see are really the government essentially providing a compensation for that. In a sense, it's quite right that the job of the government is to spread the financial burden of this economic shock across society. And that's what we've seen with these huge deficit packages are all around the world. And so essentially government is now acting as an insurer of last resort. And that's, I think, the best way of thinking about what's going on in terms of a policy perspective. How big is this crisis? Well, just to give you some context, the GFC at the end of the day cost the US about 7% of GDP as a permanent loss of GDP. Here, I think you're talking about a permanent loss of incomes of the order of 15 or 20. And that's, going out into the future. This is not, whether it's a V-shaped recovery or an L-shaped recovery, that's kind of inconsequential in some respects. There's going to be this permanent loss. Some jobs, some firms, some sectors are never ever going to recover from this. And, that's something that one has to bear in mind. And of course, it's going to exacerbate inequality. It's going to be the low skill sectors that are going to be the most hard hit. Where we end up from all of this depends very much, I think, on how expectations get managed. And just to give you a sense of how an economist might view this situation would be to sort of think about productivity. I mean, of course, New Zealand has famously got relatively low productivity. People have been concerned about it in recent years relative to the OECD. But if we rationally expect future productivity will be impaired because future incomes are going to be much lower, people are going to demand less, firms in turn will invest less, productivity is further impaired, and you can get the self-fulfilling dynamic. And managing those expectations is going to be one of the biggest jobs for government, aside from the big debts and so forth. And of course, the governments have been borrowing heavily. As a central banker, you'll probably expect me to mention central banks, and central banks have been buying bonds directly. That's really all quantitative easing has been. People worry that that's going to be inflationary because are we not monetizing the deficit? I think one can be a bit sanguine about that. By and large, what it's doing is substituting for deficient spending by firms and households. But far more importantly, inflation isn't going to take off if people perceive the central bank as being independent. And I'm going to come back to institutions and expectations quite a bit, because really it's the credibility of the institution. If the central bank is in the business of providing this deficit financing in order to attain its policy targets, and if people believe that, then inflation is not going to be quite the concern that it's made out to be in some quarters. But the deeper issue really for governments and policy is not so much boosting demand and stoking, getting a recovery going in that sense, but rather preventing lasting damage to the supply potential of the economy. And that's where this crisis is different from other crises that we've seen. And it's also got, the government's job is also to pivot and facilitate a pivot towards these high productivity innovations. We were mentioning about in our preamble about the role of digital technology and so forth, but it's getting that pivot and improving what people perceive as high productivity innovations, which will be quite key. I think that's going to be very important for countries like New Zealand. Now, of course, there's no denying the severity of the shock. We will see corporate insolvencies, household insolvencies. For emerging market countries, you'll see sovereign debt defaults. Because this kind of high level of debt finance is not particularly sustainable, particularly for poor countries. But I think at a deeper level, there is this broader issue about how we manage our institutions, because I think that's quite important. I think that Henry Kissinger has a very nice quote, which I could share with you. Nations cohere and flourish on the belief that their institutions can foresee calamity and arrest its impact and restore stability. And what he goes on to say is that when COVID is over, many countries' institutions will be perceived as having failed. And that's the challenge that he puts to us, which is that the historic challenge is to manage crises whilst building a future. And that's what the challenge is with this particular crisis. And the point really is that we're on a knife edge, and the world can go in different ways here. And as an academic, we have the luxury, or I have the luxury of viewing it more dispassionately. But there are a number of features on the global landscape that are all part of this tapestry. For a start, we're witnessing the end of the hyper-globalization era, if you like. Gone are the ages where one could get on a plane to London and come back within 48 hours. We're witnessing the rise of the strong man, if I could use that term. If you look at India, Turkey, the US, and as well as populists, if you look at the UK or Australia, you're seeing the erosion of state capacity. Bureaucracy is typically mediocre. Expertise is poo-pooed in many cases. There's a sort of quite deliberate erosion of technocratic skill has gone on, and that's been a very interesting issue. I mean, if you think about it, pandemics have been in the crisis management playbook for decades. We've known about pandemics since SARS at the very least. It was an early warning call. But very few governments around the world have risen to the challenge of preparing for this kind of an event. And you get the sense that there is there's something in our democratic systems which ends up in some kind of a result where we underinvest in crisis preparation. We see it time and again, and you even see it with the cyber attacks that we've seen lately. I mean, the level of investment in cybersecurity is probably deficient for where we've been. So I think we're at a critical juncture for institutions. I mean, will there be a backlash against globalization or not? Will we turn more to these strong men, or do we recognize the failings of these kinds of authority figures? Will we unleash a new Leviathan, that has no regard for privacy and the era of large government? Will we have a situation where there's much greater control of the economy and an erosion of rights in some sense, or can we shackle this Leviathan? I think these are big questions that we don't yet have answers to, and the world economy is poised at this juncture. I mean, certainly if you look back to the Depression and the war that followed, if you look at the lessons from history, we see that certainly in the Western democracies, the state did shoulder more responsibilities, but even though it became much bigger, society rose to the challenge. Democracies were more vigilant about their rights and so forth, and so they did shackle the Leviathan to some extent. So there are some very big issues going on, I think, and they're all connected. It's not just a narrow, here is a pandemic shock. Are we focused on, is a lockdown the right thing, or should it be a watered down lockdown? I think there are a lot of big currents going on, and I think they need to be put into some kind of context. In terms of social changes, obviously there's rising inequality. I've alluded to that. Do households and firms have the capacity to pivot economically to this new reality? And institutions and civic society have quite interesting challenges. I mean, viewed from a legal perspective, I think it's a fascinating time. I mean, I can think of insolvency law, sovereign debt default, privacy, cyber law, if there is such a thing, the institutions of the Supreme Court, both here and overseas. The way in which, for example, Boris Johnson just tore up an international treaty this week gives you a sense of what international law might look like. And also at the level of the firm, we're seeing a move from, if you like, profit maximizing shareholder value ideas to a more broader based approach, which things like environmental concerns and Racial concerns are much more prevalent. Risk management practices are changing as a result of the firm level. And so I think it's a very it's a very sort of fragile time. I don't know which way things will go. I don't think anyone does, but that's the sort of broad brush of the scene that we're in. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Prasanna. And wow, I do have lots of follow-up questions actually, but I'm going to hold them because I now want to turn to Sasha and ask Sasha really just to give his thoughts on what's happening and some introductory comments before we get into our Q&A session.
Yeah, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Craig, for the introduction. Certainly, I agree, Craig. It was really fascinating listening to Prasanna's perspective on all of that, and I must say I'm looking forward to hearing Jennifer too. Just after I'll try and keep my bit relatively brief in the circumstances. And look, a month ago or so, when I was asked to speak at the seminar, I thought I might have a reasonable perspective on the practice of law in a post-COVID world. At that stage, I think we'd been in level 1 for a couple of months, and we were all fairly proud of what we'd managed to achieve through the initial lockdown in April and May, and the way we'd managed to bounce back so effectively through June and July. And it was as if we already had at that stage, a rose-tinted view that we were in a post-COVID world, perhaps, and that perhaps we could start telling stories about a future world based on our earlier successes. But of course, as it turned out, things changed. We went back into lockdown in Auckland, and this time I think we emerged feeling a little more bruised, a little less confident, a little bit more realistic about what this thing means for us. And there were a couple of quotes in today's New Zealand Herald that I think encapsulates the world in which we currently operate. Wolfgang Manchau, his article in the Financial Times was quoted in the Herald today, and Wolfgang said, policy in times of COVID-19 amounts to decision-making under extreme uncertainty. And then, of course, with the launch of the pre-election economic forecast, Treasury Secretary Carolee McLeish said, New Zealand is heading into a period of profound uncertainty. And Finance Minister Grant Robertson warned that uncertainty is the commodity which the world now shares in abundance. So if uncertainty is the commodity the world shares in abundance, what does that mean for the practice of law? I mean, I think it's a totally legitimate point to make, that the most important thing for us all to recognize is that we do live in uncertain times. I think it becomes necessary to become adept at making decisions under extreme uncertainty. And that probably means being able to make decisions with less than perfect information, making decisions quickly and dynamically, using the best available information at the time, effectively identifying the most relevant information on which to base decisions, and being adaptive, agile, and ready to pivot as required. I mean, I think there were a number of lessons from the first lockdown which will continue to be relevant to the practice of law. Not just the sort of simple things around, the way that we all leaned into and adopted new technologies, the way we all became accustomed to working on Teams and Zoom and that sort of thing, but really that it's our interconnectedness and our collective accountability that will bring about long-term solutions. Every time I connected with members of my team and the broader team and the wider Spark leadership group, it was about the message that staying safe, being kind to each other, looking out for each other, and that famous effort of the team of 5 million was really key to our ability to work together collaboratively and to support each other through this and to find solutions in a long-term way. another point, which was a really good and important learning from the first lockdown, was the importance of clear and simple on-message communications. The other thing that was critical for us was understanding our purpose. What's the underlying reason we do things? Often it's just as important to be able to step back above the noise and refocus on the reasons behind what we're doing and why we're doing them. And to be able to show our humanity through all of this. The reality is we all face not just an uncertain future, but a really difficult future. What we saw underpinning a lot of what happened in New Zealand, and certainly at Spark in the way that we went about approaching these challenges as a company, was that showing understanding for each other's ups and downs, showing empathy, and providing the most supportive environment possible really enabled you to get the most out of people who were doing a job in extremely challenging circumstances. The other thing that we learned in the first lockdown, and certainly in the second as well, is that including a diverse range of views is now more important than ever before. You know, if the world's experts don't know the answer, there's no better catalyst for accelerating greater inclusion of a diverse range of perspectives and a diverse range of people in our organizations. Every time somebody claimed to be an expert and know the answers, they were rapidly proven wrong. But what I think probably jumped out at me is the most important sort of key learning from the sort of COVID experience that we've been through from, since March to now, is that as lawyers, our tendency has always been towards perfection, towards being correct, towards knowing all of the answers, towards having an ability to advise within a known legal framework with helpful and useful precedents to guide us. Yet here we are faced with a lot of unknowns. We're faced with a legal regime which was unknown. I remember at the start of the regime being asked, what does level 3 mean to us as a company? What does level 4 mean? What does the government expect us to do in these circumstances? We are, as Spark, a telecommunications company, and listed as an essential service. What does that mean? To what extent does that mean we can continue to operate? We are a lifeline utility. What does that mean? Can we all continue to work from the office in the usual way? And there were large gaps in the guidance that came up from government at the time. To their credit, what government did was they filled the void over time. But for us as advisors in large companies, what we needed to do was we needed to fill the void far more quickly. People needed to know what they were going to be doing in a matter of hours, not weeks. And as we worked through the information that was available to us, we made quick assessments of the likely interpretation of the guidance given by the government. I remember asking, what is the legal basis for this lockdown? And I remember researching that question and finding no answers. But when I stepped back, I said, look, we don't know what the correct legal interpretation will be just yet. But we do know we need to act, and we need to act quickly. And our assessment is the right thing to do is most likely X. And as I said, that then almost immediately flowed into external communications to our suppliers, our stakeholders, and our customers about what to expect in doing business with us, and internal communications to all of our staff across all sorts of different roles that they played. Some were essential, needed to keep the network going. Some were part and parcel of the solution that government sort of asked us to assist with. and that involved, going out and rolling out more infrastructure, quickly building new mobile cell sites to provide more broadband so that people could, where there were deficits in broadband or people were not connected, provide access to computers and technology to enable working from home better, and homeschooling for families that weren't connected or didn't have computers. And so all of that had to be done really rapidly with very little information. As an industry, telco, broadband ISPs, and technology companies sought to try to understand how we could collectively deliver a better outcome for New Zealand than we would ordinarily do on our own or in competition with each other. As a competition lawyer and as a technology lawyer, I was lucky in the sense that I was able to have reasonably quick dialogues with the Commerce Commission to give them a sense of how we were planning to approach this, the analytical framework we would put over a number of the initiatives that we might want to take as an industry, and test their thinking on that. And we got some really quick and really good responses from them in a very informal way. We also sought from time to time external legal views from some of our sort of top tier law firms that we work with. And we, as an in-house lawyer, it's not uncommon for us to often say to our external providers, we need you to be just as pragmatic as we have to be in-house. And never has it been more true than during lockdown, than during times of sort of massive uncertainty. We don't expect our external law firms to have a perfect opinion, but we certainly don't expect our external law firms to spend half a page setting out caveats to their legal advice, because that's neither to us nor to our internal business. So our external legal advisors need to be as dynamic and as on point as we are, and we rely on them to be able to, I guess, share house. The crux of it all, I think, when it comes to understanding what all of that means for the practice of law, for lawyers in a COVID world, and for the future, is understanding how to exercise your judgment as well as you possibly can. And I think the fact that I think it was the High Court or Supreme Court that found that the lockdown was unlawful for the first 9 days, but that the action taken was justified. So, whilst there was certainly we knew that we were operating in a paradigm where it was absolutely necessary to take unprecedented steps, the legality of which was not entirely clear, but which was probably going to be justified. And I think most had understood, even as we entered the first phase of lockdown. We have a sustainable governance framework in place. But that was interesting, because it said to me judgment was really critical. And then I think the other thing that's been interesting in all of this has been the sort of resurgence of a rights debate, a human rights debate. So putting things like the Black Lives Matter movement front and center of our thinking while we're in the middle of lockdown, alongside questions around, the right to freedom of movement and freedom of economic activity and those sorts of things, it probably has brought back into the sort of, higher order thinking for even corporate lawyers, the importance of these really key social issues, which are really becoming part and parcel of what we do. And if I'm honest, one of the things that at Spark we've really focused on doing is we've really focused on saying, well, actually we believe in our role of helping New Zealanders be more interconnected and participate more fully in the digital future. And we spent a lot of time building a product where we almost give away broadband to poor families, and particularly those with school-aged children. And we just grew that product massively during lockdown. Inclusion journey, and the amount of work we're doing on that. And my team, who are made up of top-tier lawyers, that's the thing that motivates and moves them the most, is just seeing how much of a difference they can make in the lives of people by creating and rolling out quickly opportunities for people to participate more broadly in this economy that we live in. I'll leave it there for now, but obviously I'm happy to take any questions and participate in the debate.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Sasha. We just had just a few sort of gaps in sound just occasionally, but so apologies to everyone on that. It's but very much we heard exactly the important points that you're making, and we've got lots of good questions to follow up with you on. Now we turn to Jennifer and to the experiences in legal practice for a major firm. So, Jennifer, no further introduction is necessary. How have you found things, and what have been the big issues for you to be thinking about?
Thanks, Craig, and hi, everybody. I've prepared a couple of slides that I'm hoping will appear on everyone's screens shortly. Let's just go to the first slide. I've distilled some thinking into 3 slides. The first is, what lessons did we take from lockdown about the way that we work as a large law firm here in New Zealand? And then we'll go on to what were the lessons that we took in terms of the work that we do and the work that we expect to be doing in the future, which is a slightly different issue. And then the third slide is really a bit of speculation about the unique opportunity that we are facing at the moment. And I prefer to look at it as a series of opportunities, although I know there's a lot of risk involved. What are the things that we need to be thinking about to not only deal with the immediate challenges in front of us, but also what investment should we be making to prepare ourselves for the future, whether that's a long recovery or a fast recovery or whatever type of recovery it might be. Bearing in mind that, of course, we're not going back to what we used to regard as normal anytime soon, or if at all, ever. So just looking at some of the more practical aspects, and obviously that's the perspective that I'm bringing to this. I took over as the national chair of Buddle Finlay on the 1st of April, so a week after the lockdown commenced, and thought to myself, how did I end up in this position, having to manage a large, multi-million-dollar revenue business in this sort of situation, global pandemic, and likely once in a generation or two recession. But anyway, there we go. We've moved on, and I've taken it in my stride, and I'm doing my best not to have too many sleepless nights. So just looking at some lessons that we took from the first lockdown, I guess, or actually both of them, about the way that we work. And some of these things are pretty obvious. What I would say is that from what I've been able to observe, some law firms coped better with that situation than others did. And I think one of the key features of those who coped better was that they had already invested quite heavily in in technological mobility for their people. And some were already well on the road to flexible and remote working. So for those firms, it was a pretty quick transition, perhaps unexpected in terms of the scale and the speed with which it had to be done, but nevertheless, it was something that had already been thought about, and there was a certain amount of infrastructure in place for. The second thing, or the big lesson, was that remote and flexible working was not only possible but productive. Now, there was, of course, I think across the whole economy, some mixed experience of working in lockdown and working permanently remotely. Those in our business who were younger people, for example, who were in flatting situations or living on their own, did have some challenges in terms of a lack of social interaction, a lack of private space within which to continue working at home, for example. And then others in our firm, I imagine, as with others outside of our sector, would have really struggled with the challenges of maintaining and managing a household with small children who were constantly at home, and other children who were having to learn remotely. So all of a sudden, a number of parents, became homeschooling teachers as well as having to continue with their work. So there were a number of challenges, but on the whole, the data that we have suggests that actually, when people were freed up from having to commute, for example, they were able to be quite productive, although it might not have looked the same as it would have looked previously. They might have done work at different times of the day. They might have done it in several bursts, whatever times were convenient for them. So really great lessons were learned around all of that. I think I'd echo a lot of what Sasha said. Successful law firms throughout this period were those where there was a high level of connectivity, where leaders were visible, leaders were authentic and open, expressing concerns, but reaching out to provide reassurance and comfort and clarity about messaging, about what was happening, and when it would happen, whether people's jobs were secure, what we expected to happen over the coming weeks and months. And often we didn't have, as Sasha's pointed out, we didn't have clear answers, but we had to reach a view that we could communicate to people to give them something tangible. And so the whole connectivity, communication, and caring for people and their well-being was paramount, and I think is actually, the new paradigm. That's the way we need to operate from now on. That's what our people will expect of us. And as part of that, I'd say, culture is directly connected to resilience. The better culture you had in place before this period, I think you would have seen translate into resilience in terms of the ability to continue working, to continue being productive, and to continue looking out for each other. I would say also, and again, this echoes some of the points Sasha has made, that our people are more than ever indicating that they value a sense of purpose about what they do. They value equity in many aspects of the way we work. They value well-being, and they're very invested in their own well-being, the well-being of their families and their colleagues, and in work-life balance. And some of the things I would note about that are, our staff were very keen to understand whether we were going to, as a firm, apply for the wage subsidy. In the event, we never came close to satisfying the trigger points to apply for that subsidy, and had already decided that even if we were to satisfy the criteria, it was very much a last resort. And our staff have fed back to us since then that they have a huge amount of respect for the decision that we made in that regard. And then just finally on this page, I'd echo at the point that Sasha made about the importance of diversity throughout this period, and making sure that we were including a range of perspectives in our decision making. That is a trend that was already well underway, but I think we have seen the value of it play out quite acutely in the last 6 months. So let's go on to the next slide, which is what was the impact, or what were the lessons that we learned from the perspective of the work that we do and the work that clients were asking us to help them with. I mean, always client focus is paramount, but this was a situation where clients themselves were facing unprecedented challenges. Their priorities were constantly shifting. They were constantly having to reprioritize. Some things became urgent very quickly. They needed clarity, as Sasha has pointed out, and pragmatism in the advice that we were delivering to them, and they needed those things quickly and in a way that was very accessible and user-friendly. There wasn't time to write great long opinions. Actually, we moved away from that some time ago. The advice and the support we needed to provide our clients needed to be, able to be deployed immediately, and also, our clients needed to collaborate with us in the truest sense. They needed empathy from us. They needed us to provide some reassurance, and they needed clarity. And Sasha has also echoed that, that's what he was expecting from his legal providers. In terms of the demand for our services, the changes that we've seen over the last 6 months are quite nuanced. There's a number of layers there. Some practice areas obviously took an immediate hit, mergers, acquisitions, and other commercial corporate transactions, particularly those driven offshore, pretty much died in their tracks. My corporate partners tell me that there are now some green shoots. There's an increased level of activity over the last month or so. They're getting more queries. People are cautiously emerging into the sunlight and saying, okay, now I'm interested in considering what I might do. So we are starting to see some renewed levels of activity, but it's likely to be some time before it gets back to what it was in, say, February of this year. Other practice areas in our firm were very busy during the lockdown period, including in particular employment, which wouldn't be surprising. A lot of dispute-related advice. My own area of resource management and infrastructure project work has continued unabated. My team and I were busy before this period, and we've continued to be busy. And as I think Craig pointed out, with some of the reforms the government has signalled and the policy framework changes that have been made, our work is continuing to be pretty demanding on that front. We are expecting that towards the end of this year and next year, our insolvency practice will become busier. That's something that Prasanna signalled. Obviously, there will be not just individual insolvency, but corporate insolvency to deal with. That's just a fact of life in a recession. Although sometimes it takes some time for those things to crystallise, and obviously we've had an extended period of government support to businesses, which is now coming to an end, and I think we will see more of that activity at the end of this year and then into next year. So that area we expect to be busy. One thing I think has helped our firm is the split between public sector and private sector work. We have always had a very strong public sector practice. The public sector is where a lot of money is being spent at the moment for obvious reasons in terms of government support to the economy. So I think perhaps those firms who have had more of a weighting towards private sector work perhaps will have had a harder time of it. What else? Flexibility and creativity in the delivery of client service is here to stay and needs ongoing focus. And I think we'd already started to see that trend, but I think this crisis has just exacerbated that. And it represents a real opportunity for law firms to be, really inquiring into what else is possible in the way that we can deliver our services to clients. As I think I'm going to say on the next slide, we managed to do the unthinkable in a couple of respects at the beginning of lockdown or through lockdown, and there's no reason why we shouldn't be looking around at everything else we've done for 100 years and say, what other things can we just rip up and throw out and refresh and reinvent? Now is the time to be looking at those things. And then finally, for this slide, in terms of our work profile and our practice areas, it's time now. The immediate firefighting has come to an end. Obviously, we're still keeping a very close eye on costs and revenue and the ability to be very efficient in the way we do our work. But now is the time to also be taking a long-term view and to be ready to invest to provide a really strong foundation for recovery in whatever form that might take. And I'd particularly say it's time to invest in people in the practice areas that we can already forecast will be in demand over the next couple of years. So then just finally, some thoughts about the opportunities that we have. I've said here, obviously there's no return to normal. And for some people that's fairly confronting. For some people who've been around a long time, the law is a fairly traditional profession in many ways. We've done things the same for a long time, and some of the considerations that are confronting us now are things that some people are very uncomfortable with. But I think really the only way to regard this is to view it as a series of extraordinary opportunities that we can elect to step into. And if you really want a sense of purpose about the way you work, then, arguably this is the most exciting thing that's ever happened. I think on a pragmatic level, a number of people have said to me, oh, this is the death of the big office. Well, I don't actually agree with that. I think law firm offices will remain an important focus of the work that we do, despite the fact that many more of us are working remotely. As a law firm, our ability to come together is still incredibly important to the way we work. It's also incredibly important to our people, particularly those in the early years of their career. Being together and working on matters collaboratively and working with our clients collaboratively, although some of it can be done remotely, is still really important in terms of training our people and giving them the experience they need. So we don't expect that we'll be giving up our lease anytime soon. We might configure our space differently. That's certainly a possibility. The changes, I think, as I've indicated, changes we thought difficult and gradual happened overnight. And the prime example is flexible working. As a firm, we had started developing a policy in that regard, over a year ago. We'd been testing it, having workshops about it. And when you think about it now, you think, well, why did it take so long? It surely should have been something we could have done sooner. And at the end of the day, it was forced on us, and nobody died. It was something we were able to make happen. There were a few glitches in the early days, but it happened. And then you say to yourself, well, what are the other things that we've been doing for years that we don't need to do anymore, or that we can do differently? So, I think there's a whole world of innovation that is waiting for people to explore. In successful and resilient firms, in my view, the experience of this year will build brand loyalty from both people and from clients. And the important thing is not to squander that. If you have been through a tough experience with your people and your clients, that counts for something. And the thing to do now is to build on it and take it to the next level. And then finally, I've just made the point, and I think someone else has made that point. I think it was probably Prasanna. The traditional model of leverage and making profits in law firms is probably under scrutiny. It has been for some time, but I think all of a sudden things will. I think there will be, clients will want to have things done differently. There'll be cost pressure more than we've seen previously. We're already dealing with trends such as the growth of in-house teams, for example, client demand for more senior and complex support, which is reshaping the way we structure ourselves internally. Those trends will be exacerbated and accelerated as a result of this crisis. And again, that also presents an opportunity. I think that's probably all I need to say right now, but I'm happy to answer questions.
That's wonderful. Thank you. Thank you so much. Well, now can I invite our audience, our online audience, to send any questions in. While we're waiting for those, I do have some questions that I'd love to ask. You'll forgive me, I hope, with this question, Prasanna, but being a tax person, I've been absolutely fascinated, and I was part of a group that were involved in, I guess, being sort of the feedback for Treasury and for revenue policy, and I've never seen the revenue policy people wearing hats where they don't care about materiality, where their desperate desire is to give money away. This is like an extraordinary situation, and where, in fact, their primary focus on new legislation and on rules to do with lending is based on trust, not on it was pushing out to remedy the effect, to cushion the consequences of the lockdown. The forecast is for us as a country to have 200 billion in borrowings by 2024. And you alluded to this issue, but countries around the world are in a worse position of borrowings as percentages to GDP than we are forecast to get to by 2024. But do we need to pay this back? I mean, there's a huge political and tax consequence to this, in the sense of, I mean, are we seeing a long-term trend towards greater indebtedness by countries, or do you think this must necessarily involve higher tax revenues? I'm sorry, it's a very tax-related question. But
no, understood. I mean, I think the first thing an economist will tell you is that when you're faced with a big negative shock, which COVID clearly is, the standard policy prescription is to spend and essentially borrow, that's essentially what we're seeing here. As I alluded to, in order to make this credible, the size of the package had to be big, and that accounts for the scale that you're seeing almost everywhere. I mean, people are, the government is stepping in as this insurer of last resort and essentially providing, through various mechanisms, support for firms and households. Now, there are two things here. One is that interest rates are going to be low for very long. I think you can pretty much have it as a surety that I think for the next decade or so, interest rates are not going to ever go back to 5% or thereabouts. It's going to be very, very low for very long, I think. And when interest rates are that low, high levels of debt tend to be sustainable. So in other words, growth rates will tend to be in excess of interest payments, and so this debt can be continually paid back. So the implications for future generations are going to be much more modest than the big headline figures would lead you to believe. So yes, there will be at some point some level of taxation and so forth, but it's not necessarily going to be the sort of thing that we dreaded, say, a decade ago, where if you had sort of spoken to the National Party a decade ago and it was about to go to election, and they'll be giving you a lecture on the value of good housekeeping and why you wouldn't want to sort of go into debt. So I think it's much more sustainable. Low interest rates will be there for the foreseeable future. And in the event that there is some inflation, that's going to make essentially erode away some of the debt as well. So,
well, of course, and in a strange way, that's the positive side of inflationary consequences.
Exactly.
As the principal gets smaller. But so I just need to check in with everyone, because I realise that we are actually at time. But I think that's my error on this should have been a longer session. Would we be available for another 10 minutes or so, just to carry on with the questions, if that's a possibility? Because thank you. I know. Well, certainly I'd appreciate it. There was a very interesting question here, and it's what kind of diverse range of perspectives need to be considered? Some examples, please. Thank you. Now, I think this was a question actually to both Sasha and to Jennifer, because you both, Sasha particularly, made reference to it, but Jennifer, you were definitely making it clear that was part of the decision-making framework that you were considering too. So, to you both.
Okay, I'm happy to jump in to start with, just because I guess I was before you, Jennifer, in the order of speaking. But just to pick up on a couple of points that Jennifer also made, my first point, my point was, what we realized during COVID was, you're faced with a lot of information, and having to make judgments and decisions in the face of infodemics has become a skill all to itself. But that's not necessarily a bad thing, having lots of information. But what could be a bad thing is shutting out legitimate perspectives. And so when it came to, I think Jennifer articulated it well, understanding that your team of people would be both those that are in a flatting situation and in a relatively small space and commonly enjoy spending time outside, with others, versus those that are in a family situation with young children who need actual assistance in doing their schoolwork, and understanding that your stakeholders or your customers will all have different needs. All of those things are something that you really did need to take into account during the sort of height of lockdown. And when we did that, we tried to do that by inviting those perspectives into the discussion up front, rather than assuming that a key decision maker would know the answers and would simply tell you what to do. And you'd go ahead and do that. So it was a diverse range of perspectives across the board on a number of things. But certainly what we found was that there was no longer this expectation that one person would know all the answers and that they would be perfect. That even when it came to understanding what the law was, for example, it made sense to be collaborative in your approach, to ask the questions, to be open to exploring and challenging each other's views, and then to sort of finding a way through that with that sort of pragmatic approach. So, looking at learning from decisions other in-house teams were making, decisions that other telcos were making, decisions that law firms were making. We really were quite open to actually taking on all of the information, trying to distill that into, something meaningful, and then taking the best of our teams and using their inputs to actually, work out, what's ideal as a way forward.
I'll just comment briefly on that. I think that's absolutely right. That's certainly what I was trying to get at. I think we saw a move away from a lot of top-down decision making in terms of management of the firm. I was participating in a number of focus groups throughout that period, a number of decision-making bodies, a number of information gathering bodies from within the firm. It wasn't just me as the chair and my chief executive. It was both of us taking soundings from our people and culture director and her team. you know, some of our client service team, and also people spread throughout the firm. We were seeking input from a lot of different people across the firm into some of the decisions that we were making, and that's, you know, frankly, it's not something that we've done to that extent before, but it was incredibly valuable. So. And also extending that to our clients, understanding what pressures our clients were under. I mean, you know, when you are on a Zoom meeting or a Microsoft Teams meeting with, you know, a very important client, and, you know, you can see their 3-year-old prancing around naked in the background, it gives you a whole new way of relating to that person. And similarly, you know, I had cats walking all over my keyboard when I was on meetings. I mean, you know, you were able to relate to people in a more human and a more authentic way. And I think that gave us access to a whole bunch of different perspectives, and a new way of understanding the people that we were dealing with, you know, as people, not just as, you know, talking heads.
Do you know, it's extraordinary because I think all of you have referred to, whether it was through competence in government and care for people, or Jennifer, you were talking about directly, you know, communicating and caring for people. One of the strongest themes of this, of each of your presentations, has been the fact that the need to look out and value and care for people is one of the sort of like the largest elements of learning for your respective organizations, or one of the critical points for direction and government. And what I'm struggling to reconcile is, and I recognize the importance of that. I recognize the importance of consultation and regarding people as humans, but also you accentuate a huge need for investment. And, you know, in the commercial world, doesn't something have to give? You can't invest in people, you can't invest in things, and at the same time the economy is sort of down. You know, the forecast is, the latest result is it's down 16% of GDP in the pre-fu. So profitability must decline as a result, I assume.
Well, as I indicated, it really depends on the practice profile that you have as a law firm. You know, how exposed are you to the tourism sector, for example?
Yeah.
You know, how exposed are you to the agricultural sector or the IT sector? And it is going to be winners and losers. We've already seen that. Some of those things will be unexpected, but some of them we can already see having played out. You know, I imagine the law firms who act for New Zealand might have interesting observations on some of those things, but
yeah.
There will always be winners and losers in these types of situations. And, you know, we just need to do a bit of tea leaf reading and figure out, you know, where are the areas where we will need to be redeploying resource? Where are the areas where we can already see that this practice area in a couple of years will be far less important than it is now? And if that's the case, can we just allow that to wind down in a fairly natural way, or do we need to make interventions to have that happen in a certain way? It's not, you know, we're not talking blunt instruments here. These are very nuanced decisions, and we have to take a reasonably medium to long-term view.
Yeah.
But there will be areas where we'll need to redeploy resource and change the emphasis and how things are structured, for example. And there's also going to be new areas of business coming online that we hadn't anticipated. And some areas that have been quiet will actually become really busy. So it's going to be swings and roundabouts. Now, you know, will our revenue be what it was last year? Probably not. But, you know, we're still here. We're still committed to being a full service law firm. We've survived recessions before. We've survived, you know, our Christchurch office going through the earthquakes, for example, we've seen firsthand through that experience just how a professional services firm can bounce back and rebuild. So I think that's the message that we've been giving our people, is that yes, these are uncertain times, but the fundamentals of our business are good, and we've got credible people running the show.
And so, just turning this back, and probably just for a final comment for each of you, actually, is, for the graduates or the potential postgraduates of the of the law faculty, or of and in fact there's a question in the Q&A from an overseas lawyer who has an LLM in intellectual property. What would you recommend? I mean, it's sort of, I hate this, the self-serving nature of this particular inquiry, but I guess people are going to be faced, aren't they? They obviously need to find, for a variety of different reasons, we are going to be in a period of great change and uncertainty, and companies like Sasha's are going to have to invest, both in their people and in their and yours too, Jennifer, as well too, and Prasanna and I, sort of here at the University of Auckland, I can assure you, we are facing hugely complex and difficult times. There are forecast loss in revenues and redundancies and all sorts of things that are in our circumstance. So what would you recommend for the students of 2021?
My initial thoughts about that are probably the same as they've always been, which is that it doesn't really matter as long as you have some really good technical skills and a pretty good EQ. I think people with the ability to build relationships and work alongside other people to develop solutions to problems, those are the skills that we are interested in. And does it matter to me whether you take all the IT courses or all the commercial courses or all the litigation-based and procedural courses? No, it doesn't really matter to me. Yeah. I just want to know that you can think. I am increasingly encouraging people to upskill themselves on project management, on the project management side. In a lot of the work I've done on in the infrastructure sector, I can see a number of project management skills which I would like to see deployed more often in a law firm environment. So I personally don't think it matters. Look, if you're really interested in insolvency, then yes, there'll be a lot of insolvency work around, I suspect, for a few years. So go for it. But I'm more interested in the skill base and in seeing people who are, thoughtful, willing to work as part of a team, interested in innovating and finding solutions to problems.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Thank you, Sasha. What would you say?
From my perspective, I think certainly Jennifer's point that you have really good technical skills, be the best lawyer you can be, continues to be relevant. But what we are seeing is really it's about having the right mindset and the right attitude, and being adaptable. So being ready to pivot, being able to articulate not just your own legal advice in a way that's relevant to your clients, but to be able to demonstrate leadership through the way that you interact with others, and the way that you influence and shape outcomes. That's something that we've found a lot of our lawyers are actually really good at. And I know that there have been in-house teams, for example, who have been working for companies whose revenues have dropped 97%. Yet the legal teams are busier than ever because everybody's actually seeking the lawyers out for guidance, seeking the lawyers out for advice on all sorts of things, seeking the lawyers out to help deliver outcomes. And so that ability to use your technical skills and your, broad-minded, positive approach to things, and to be able to engage, influence, and shape outcomes is going to be, I think, quite important going forward, with a degree of pragmatism sort of wrapped up in all of that.
Yeah, no, fabulous. And Prasanna, just a last comment from you. Do you think the world will ever be the same?
Yes and no, in the sense that you will certainly see that things will return to some kind of normality, but it's going to be a normality that might look like something from the past, in the 1970s even, for a good long while. I think society is a resilient beast, and I think it will pivot. One can't ever tell which direction it will go, but I think it will be the same. I mean, there will still be the same underlying forces driving firms, households, and governments at the end of the day, and I don't expect anything to change that much. But we live in very interesting times, so we just have to.
Oh, great! A return to heavy metal brands. So, can I say thank you on behalf of our audience? You've been very generous with your time, and I'm actually, incredibly uplifted by what you've said, all of you, because it is about focusing on the positives and what can be done, not about the negatives. And so we're going to leave our audience is going to leave us now, and so thank you very much, audience, for being there. And if you want to see this, and I'm sure it'll be available as a recording again, and you can also see another question and answer session that we had with some alumni from our LLM, Master of Legal Studies and Master of Taxation Studies programs and PhD programs. So that might be of interest to some of you. Thank you very much.